There are people who enter history not because they are perfect, but because they carry within themselves a contradiction that no one can look away from. John Wayne was one of them. He was not only an actor, not only the emblem of the Western genre, but also the image of an America that always wanted to believe in strength, in honor, in footsteps that never faltered. Yet even as the world hailed him as a hero, John Wayne lived with truths he could never bring himself to say aloud. Born with the name Marion Morrison, a name that carried nothing of the aura of a legend, he grew up with the feeling that he had to become someone stronger in order to survive. And throughout his life, that obsession never left him. John Wayne created the image of a man who knew no fear. But deep inside, he always feared one thing: the day the world might discover that the hero was merely a shell Hollywood had placed on the shoulders of a man who had to strain every day just to keep from collapsing. To the audience, he was the voice of steadfastness, loyalty, and fortitude. But to those who had been close to him, John Wayne was a man constantly torn apart. Torn between pride and insecurity, between the public worship of the Duke and the pieces of his life he wished he could forget. There were compliments that left him silent. There were legends that trapped him. The more he was praised, the more he feared he did not deserve what people believed about him. The story of John Wayne does not begin with a triumph, nor with a hero's oath. It begins with a profoundly human lack, the feeling of never being enough. He had to prove that he was strong, loyal, unbreakable, not only on screen, but in his own storm-ridden life. And it was precisely this obsession with being stronger than he truly was that led him through choices that sometimes shone brilliantly, and at other times were marked by fractures. What made John Wayne such a compelling figure was not the unyielding image the audience saw, but the contradictions he tried to hide. Determined yet insecure, tough yet easily wounded, beloved yet afraid of being seen through. A dazzling exterior with an inner darkness no one could reach. He was an icon, but also a man burdened all his life by that very icon. And from that contradiction, the central question emerges more clearly than ever. What transformed a boy named Marion Morrison into the face America used to define courage? And what was the true price of that image? That is the journey we are about to enter. A journey not to polish the halo, but to go deeper, into the places where a hero pays with loneliness, with inner wounds, and with the parts of himself he never wanted anyone to see. John Wayne was born Marion Robert Morrison on May 26, 1907 in Winterset, a small town in the state of Iowa. In the memories he shared many years later, he always mentioned that hometown with an even, quiet voice, as if the things formed in his childhood had become something he could never escape. His father, Clyde Morrison, was a kind man, but not a fortunate one. He failed in many business ventures and always carried a sadness behind him, like a lingering shadow. His mother, Mary Brown, on the other hand, was so strict that young Marion often didn't know where to find gentleness. In that small house, affection was rarely spoken aloud, and hugs, if they happened, were often hidden behind demands to be strong, to stand upright, to endure. In 1911, the family moved to California in hopes of a new beginning, but what they found first was poverty. That was when Marion began to understand that life would not pave a path for him. In a rare interview, John Wayne once said, "We had nothing but responsibility and loud voices." A line that sounded like a joke was, in truth, his entire childhood. a boy who had to learn to endure, to shoulder burdens, and to never show weakness. Because in that family, weakness was never an option. His years at Glendale High School were the first time Marion felt he had value. Football opened for him a world where people didn't look at his poverty or the sadness inside his home, but at his strength, determination, and ability to push forward. From 1920 to 1925, Marion became one of the school's top players, good enough to earn a scholarship to USC, something he believed would change his life. For the first time, the future seemed to have a clear path. Effort, discipline, and a bit of luck had opened a door he never dared to imagine. But Marion Morrison's life had a way of testing him in its own harsh manner. One day, while surfing in Newport Beach, a pastime he used to ease the heaviness inside, a hard fall caused a severe shoulder injury. By the time he regained clarity, the scholarship was gone. Everything he had built over the years collapsed in an instant. His athletic dream shattered too quickly for him to even feel disappointment. All he knew was that he had to work, had to live, had to find a new road. And that road led him to Hollywood. Not through a golden opportunity, not through a talent scout's gaze, but through a job hauling props around dusty film sets. It was there that Marion began to understand that what people call a dream is sometimes something built by hands that simply have no other choice. He did everything, pulling cables, carrying backdrops, cleaning sets. No one in Hollywood at that time knew that the tall young man would one day become John Wayne, and neither did he. All he knew was this: to survive, he had to be stronger than everything he felt inside. John Wayne's childhood and youth had no glorious tales, no sweet memories. But it was precisely because of the lack of gentleness, the absence of nurturing, that Marion had to forge his own hard shell. Over time, that shell became a manner, a steady, deep voice, a commanding posture that audiences around the world would one day recognize. And it all began with a boy trying to grow up in a family that never allowed softness. That is the root of John Wayne, a man who built strength out of deprivation, and who found his path not through what life gave him, but through what life had taken away. Hollywood in the 1920s was not a place for the weak, and Marion Morrison, the young man who had just lost his scholarship and his sense of direction, walked into it with empty hands. He did not have the look of a star of that era, had no connections, and had none of the confidence to say he had come to conquer the movies. Marion only knew how to work. In 1926, he started at Fox Studios hauling props, setting up backdrops, cleaning sets, appearing faintly in background scenes no one remembered. None of the people passing by him knew they were looking at a future Hollywood figure, and he himself never dared to think he belonged in that world. Marion just kept his head down, tried not to get fired, and swallowed all his exhaustion. To his colleagues, Marion was the tall, kind, but clumsy guy. Once he tripped over a backdrop and brought down an entire set piece. People laughed, and he simply bowed his head, apologized, and continued as if nothing had happened. Wayne would later recall, "I had nothing but strong hands and the ability not to complain." Perhaps it was precisely that which made those who observed him the longest begin to notice something even Marion himself had not seen. A straightforwardness, a natural masculinity that didn't need embellishment. Henry Hathaway, an assistant director at the time, was the first to notice it. Hathaway often watched Marion pull cables, haul props, and never complain. He said, "The kid can't act. but he's got a presence the camera likes. From background roles, Marion slowly began standing closer to the camera. Not because he had acting talent, but because Hathaway believed that face carried something audiences could trust. Quietly, Hathaway introduced Marion to Raoul Walsh, a director searching for a young face for a major project called The Big Trail. The meeting between Marion and Walsh was quiet. No screen test, no bright lights, no glamorous introductions. Marion stood before Walsh with all the awkwardness, honesty, and shyness of someone not used to being noticed. Walsh looked at him for a few minutes, then said, "The kid doesn't need to act. He is the West." It was a moment of destiny. Marion Morrison was cast in the lead role of The Big Trail, and the studio immediately changed his name to John Wayne. No one asked whether he wanted that. They simply said, "A man 6'4", with a deep voice and the walk of a cowboy, can't be named Marion." Wayne would later recall with a stunned tone, "I didn't choose that name. Hollywood put it on me, and I had to live with it." But destiny is not always as simple as people imagine. The Big Trail was a disaster. The new widescreen technology drove up costs, audiences weren't ready, and John Wayne, the newly minted name, sank instantly. There were no more leading roles for him. From 1931 to 1938, Wayne appeared in more than 80 B-westerns. These films were shot in a few days. With budgets so small, actors often provided their own costumes. Wayne was so poor, he once agreed to a pay cut just to keep working. The money was so little, he had to count every penny before paying rent. When a director said he couldn't afford to pay him $75 a week, Wayne nodded immediately. "60 will do, as long as you let me work." It wasn't self-deprecation. It was his greatest fear, the fear of being replaced. During those years, Wayne learned that Hollywood had no mercy. To survive, he had to endure more than anyone imagined. Once, while doing extra work in a John Ford film, Wayne looked into the camera a moment too long. Ford barked at him, "Don't look like some lost kid," and kicked him off the set. Wayne didn't protest. He simply walked away quietly. He admired Ford so deeply that the reprimand hurt more than any rejection. Yet Ford, in his strangest way, taught Wayne a lesson. If you want to stand in front of a camera, you must first learn to withstand the harshness of the one who observes you. That harshness lasted so long that at one point, Wayne believed he couldn't go on. In 1934, after dozens of forgettable films, he applied to the Coast Guard for stable work and a normal life. His application was rejected because he was too tall. A small twist of fate, yet it became an invisible hand pushing him back toward Hollywood, the place he thought he no longer belonged. Amid those B-movies, Wayne met Josephine Sayence, the woman he married in 1933. Josephine came from a wealthy Catholic family, and their marriage seemed like it might offer Wayne a protection he had never known. But when reality hit, the distance between ideals and life grew larger. Financial pressure weighed on Wayne, while his artistic ambition clung to him relentlessly, making him constantly feel he wasn't good enough, wasn't attractive enough, wasn't successful enough to support anyone. Josephine loved him, but she couldn't understand the fears he carried. Wayne loved his family, but he was consumed by the feeling that he needed to do more, to prove himself more, so he wouldn't be seen as a burden. They began drifting apart within the very home they shared. Josephine needed presence. Wayne sank into the obsession of a path he had yet to find, and that quiet distance was enough to create the first cracks. For John Wayne, 12 years of obscurity were not merely the beginning of a Hollywood career. They were a test to see whether he had the patience, the hardness, and the resolve to stand firm in a world that rarely smiled upon the weak. And it was precisely in those forgotten years that a crucial part of John Wayne was forged. A resilience bordering on ruthless. A silent endurance that audiences would later see on screen. John Wayne entered Hollywood empty-handed. But when he emerged from those years of anonymity, he carried something far stronger than fame, an unbreakable will. And that became the foundation of the legend that would explode just a few years later. After nearly 12 years forgotten in the shadows of B-movies, John Wayne no longer waited for miracles. He had grown accustomed to being underestimated, accustomed to cheap costumes, short lines, and shooting schedules that stretched from dawn until late into the night. Wayne thought his life would simply drift on like that, quiet, steady, unnoticed. But destiny sometimes waits for the moment when a person has hardened long enough to test them with the biggest opportunity of their life. That opportunity was named John Ford. Among Hollywood directors, Ford was the man Wayne feared and admired the most. Ford did not believe Wayne was a great actor, but he knew Wayne possessed something rare among actors of the time: truth. This man didn't perform to impress. He simply was himself. And in an era when Hollywood was searching for the model of the American man, Ford recognized that Wayne's bluntness and grit were enough to shape an icon. In 1939, Ford cast Wayne as Ringo Kid in Stagecoach, not because Wayne was the best, not because he was the most beloved. Ford wanted a face the audience had never grown used to, a man who could make them believe that a hero wasn't a polished superhuman, but someone beaten down by life who had not lost his pride. Wayne had lived exactly that for more than a decade. The role seemed carved out of his own wandering years. Wayne didn't understand why Ford chose him. During the costume fitting, he asked, "What do I have to do?" Ford replied, "Don't do anything, just be you." Wayne didn't know Ford was preparing him for a moment that would change his entire life and the history of Hollywood. To create that moment, Ford did something very characteristic of him. He called Wayne out in front of the entire crew and berated him mercilessly. He told Wayne he was a failure, a guy who spent 10 years in B pictures no one remembers, someone unworthy of standing in front of his camera. Everyone was stunned. Only later did those close to Ford understand. He did it deliberately to push Wayne to an emotional breaking point, so that when the camera captured the eyes of Ringo Kid, it wouldn't be acting. It would be the real pain of a man once discarded by life. The now famous spin, simple as it looked, was something Wayne practiced for weeks, until the Winchester rifle felt like part of his body. Never slipping, never trembling, never out of place. He said, "I had to make people believe Ringo Kid had lived with that gun his whole life." The shot lasted only seconds, but Wayne trained for hours every day, until his hands blistered and healed again and again. And then the moment arrived. The turn on the stagecoach, a shot of only a few seconds, but one that changed everything. The camera opened onto John Wayne's face. Steady eyes, upright stance, the gun in his hand as if fused to his being. No smile, no showmanship, only a quiet question in his gaze. What has this man been through to stand so firmly? What few people know is that even the editing room fell silent. When Wayne watched the first rough cut, he didn't speak for a long time. Someone beside him recalled, he looked at himself as if, for the first time, he believed he had worth. Because for the first time, he saw a version of himself he had never dared to imagine. The audience saw Ringo Kid, but Hollywood saw John Wayne. And from that moment on, everything changed so quickly that even he couldn't keep up. After Stagecoach, the Western genre shifted, and Wayne entered what many call the John Wayne era. Red River, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, The Searchers, films that didn't need much promotion, because with that name alone, audiences already knew what they would see. A man of few words, strong, loyal to the point of stubbornness, ready to sacrifice for something larger than himself. John Wayne embodied the American hero so naturally, it felt as though he had been born to be it. Yet behind the on-screen strength was a feeling he never voiced, the sense of being separated from himself. As fame grew, Wayne began to realize that Ringo Kid was no longer just a role. It had become a shadow cast over his private life. He was no longer allowed to err, no longer allowed to be weak, no longer allowed to admit the fear he had carried since youth. Fans wanted an unbreakable John Wayne, but Wayne, in many moments, just wanted to breathe like an ordinary man. The gap between the icon and the real person began to show cracks in his personal life. His marriage to Josephine Saenz, the woman who had believed in him when he was still a nobody, slowly eroded. Success changed Wayne, or rather, made him feel he had to change to meet the expectations of millions of eyes watching him. Josephine wanted a family man. Wayne was consumed by major projects. He worked constantly, rarely came home before midnight, and carried the weight of the hero America demanded. Wayne didn't know how to be a husband. He only knew how to work, and Josephine once said, "John loves us, but Hollywood loves him more." And amid all that chaos, Wayne met Esperanza Bauer, a beautiful, proud, fiery woman. They were drawn to each other in the most dangerous way. She found in him the strength she lacked, and he found in her the intensity his domestic life didn't have. Their relationship began at the exact moment Wayne was entering the most exhausted phase of his first marriage. It was the beginning of a collapse, and the beginning of an emotional storm that drained him more than any role ever could. In 1953, his marriage to Josephine Saenz ended. Wayne never spoke much about the reasons, but those close to him knew he carried a deep conflict. He loved his family, but he also feared being bound to a life he wasn't ready for. And before his heart had time to heal, in 1954, Wayne married Esperanza Bauer, a marriage he would later call the darkest chapter of my life. During this entire period, John Wayne became the symbol of America. But to maintain that image, he had to sacrifice far deeper things: peace, the ability to live like an ordinary man, and at times, even the truth about himself. Nobody knows exactly when Wayne began to feel lonely. Only that the more famous he became, the more he realized. The larger the hero on screen grew, the more the man behind that image had to strain to keep standing. From the moment he spun around on that stagecoach in 1939, John Wayne stepped onto a path with no return. And Hollywood, though it loved him, never allowed him to decide the course of his own life again. In Hollywood, no legend reaches the top without confronting the shadow of his own making. After 2 decades in the blazing spotlight, John Wayne had grown accustomed to being called an American icon. But from that very moment, he began entering a phase in which every decision, every word, every personal choice became a sharp blade. And The Conqueror was the first cut, his gravest mistake, his cruelest burden, and the most haunting wound of his life. 1956, John Wayne agreed to play Genghis Khan in The Conqueror, a choice Hollywood would later call the worst casting decision in film history. But to Wayne at the time, the role wasn't the issue. His reason for accepting it was simpler. He wanted to try something new, to escape the image that had clung to him, to prove he could act, not just exist as a fixed symbol. No one told him the project was doomed from the script's first page. The Conqueror was filmed in St. George, Utah, a beautiful, barren land hiding a horrifying secret. It sat near the site of U.S. nuclear tests in Nevada only a few years before. The soil, sand, wind, and air were laced with radiation no one knew about. Some mornings, fine dust lifted by strong winds covered the entire crew in a pale sheet. Wayne and the team thought it was ordinary desert sand. They breathed it in, felt it settle on their skin, clinging to their clothes and hair. Later, a number emerged that suffocated Hollywood. Of the 220 people in the crew, more than 90 developed cancer. Among them were John Wayne, Susan Hayward, director Dick Powell, and countless crew members. No one knows for certain whether the film planted the disease inside Wayne's body. But he always believed that those days in Utah marked the beginning of the battle he would face years later: lung cancer. That is what made The Conqueror a wound that never healed. Not because the film failed, or because Wayne was criticized, but because it carried the cost of a life, and not just his. But Wayne's pain during this period did not come only from the shadow of illness. It lived in the chaos of his private life, in volatile relationships, in political controversies that made him one of the most polarizing figures in America. His marriage to Esperanza Bauer, a woman of passion and storms, became a drawn-out battlefield. Wayne loved her strength, but feared it too. They loved each other with fire, but burned each other with jealousy. Esperanza frequently suspected him of infidelity, and in a fit of rage once fired a gun into the wall as Wayne walked into the house. He kept silent afterward, as if silence could preserve whatever remained of their affection. But it only led their marriage more quickly to the edge. Wayne would later call it a battlefield with no winners. A friend once said, "John would rather face 3 armed bandits than face his own emotions." And that very truth made this marriage the darkest chapter of his life. But Wayne had no time to step back and think about himself. Hollywood kept placing on his shoulders the roles of hero, father, protector, characters who always stood firm, always knew right from wrong, always sacrificed. These roles pushed him further from his true emotions. When you become the symbol of a nation, you lose the right to be weak. And that was the harshest solitude Wayne endured. Amid this personal turmoil, Wayne was thrust into the center of political conflict. He openly supported the Vietnam War, openly opposed the anti-war movement, openly criticized progressive ideas. He became the face of conservative Hollywood. Fans loved him and called him the Duke of America. Critics denounced him as the icon of extreme conservatism. One critic once wrote, "John Wayne doesn't just play heroes on screen. He wants to be a hero in real life, and that is his mistake." Wayne had no regrets, but he was lonely. From the outside, people saw Wayne as strong, confident, an unshakable monument, but inside, he constantly fought the feeling of not being good enough, not worthy enough. He never overcame the fear of being replaced, a fear rooted in the years when he was a nobody. He took on too many films, worked himself to exhaustion, always treating himself as someone who had to prove his value every day. Wayne once said, "I'm afraid if I rest too long, someone else will do it better." That fear grew heavier when he faced criticism for not enlisting in World War II. While colleagues like Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, and Henry Fonda served, Wayne remained in Hollywood, signing more studio contracts. He explained that he had a family to support, that he had applied but been delayed. But the public didn't let go. When the image of America's hero was built up, those accusations became a wound that never fully healed. A colleague said, "Wayne spent his whole life trying to make up for that guilt. Then, in 1964, Wayne faced the most dangerous enemy of his life: lung cancer. After years of smoking several packs a day, the invisible scars from the conqueror began to surface. He had to have one lung and 2 ribs removed. For an actor whose craft relied on powerful breath and a deep, resonant voice, it was a devastating blow. But Wayne refused to fall. He returned to set so quickly that doctors warned him. Wayne simply said, "If I take too long a break, they'll find someone else." By the early 1970s, as Wayne entered his 60s, the shadow of the Duke had grown too big. So big that the man underneath was slowly being buried alive. And then came 1971, the infamous Playboy interview that shook his career. His remarks about race, Native Americans, and the civil rights movement turned his image into a battleground of controversy. He didn't apologize, didn't retract. And that stubbornness made him seem increasingly like a man of the past, a monument standing out of place in a changing era. From 1956 to 1974, John Wayne lived in contradiction. The more famous he grew, the lonelier he felt. The more heroes he played, the less he was allowed to be human. The more America adored him, the more he feared he wasn't worthy. Between the bright blaze of fame and the darkness of old wounds, Wayne walked forward with the toughness he had learned since childhood. But with each step, he felt the weight of the price every hero must pay. And it was then that his life entered its deepest low point: illness, emotional collapse, and endless controversy. But in those bleak years, the first sparks of his later life also began to appear, where he would find something rarer than fame: peace. During the years when the brighter his fame burned, the longer the darkness inside him stretched, John Wayne found a small but steady light beside Pilar Palette, a woman 21 years younger than he was, yet possessing a calm strong enough to hold back all the headwinds of his life. They met in 1953 in Peru, while Wayne was preparing the Alamo. Pilar was unlike any woman he had ever known: quiet, composed, untouched by Hollywood's glitter. When Wayne returned to see her a second time, he already sensed he was standing before something rare in his life, a sense of safety he had never felt, not even in the years with Josephine or in the fiery turbulence of Esperanza. They married in 1954, in a ceremony with no noise, almost the opposite of the spectacle the world associated with the name John Wayne. From that moment, Pilar became the quiet companion of his life, the kind of love that didn't explode, didn't create storms, yet had the power to soothe a man who had been hardened and sharpened by life far too early. Many colleagues said Wayne could snap at an entire film crew, but if Pilar gently said, "John, don't forget you're a good man," he softened instantly. No one else could do that. Pilar carried a 16mm camera everywhere, always filming Wayne behind the scenes, not to show off, but to preserve moments she knew he would cherish someday. Though he hated being filmed, Wayne often burst into laughter whenever Pilar told him, "You'll want to see this when you're old." Those were the rare moments in his life when John Wayne wasn't John Wayne, just a man smiling at the woman he loved. But life doesn't always move in a single rhythm. By the early 1970s, they separated, not because they stopped loving each other, but because Wayne was swallowed by the pressure of fame, while Pilar felt herself living under a shadow too large. Still, they never divorced. Wayne continued to see Pilar as the only one who understands me, and Pilar, in silence, continued caring for him in her own way, keeping the house, sorting paperwork, making sure the children always knew that their busy father still had a home to return to. In his final years, Wayne spent more time with his children, especially Michael and Ethan, two kids he always felt he owed far too much time. He once confided to a close friend, "All my life I've played the strong man. Now I just want to be Marion again." It was a rare confession, revealing that behind John Wayne's proud, upright figure was a man exhausted from being strong for far too long. And then destiny returned to Wayne's life in a strange way. In 1976, he accepted the lead in The Shootist, the story of an aging gunslinger dying of cancer, searching for a dignified end to his life. Many close friends warned him that the role mirrored his real life too closely. Wayne simply smiled. Perhaps he knew this was his chance to express something he had never been able to say. Fear. The role, in the gentlest way, allowed him to confront himself. While filming The Shootist, Wayne did not act like a man playing someone dying. He acted like a man who had truly walked through that pain. On set, people said his eyes carried a depth beyond words, as if Wayne knew his own life was nearing its final chapter, and the film was his quiet farewell to the audience. What moved people most was that despite multiple illnesses and constant pain, Wayne still tried to maintain the bearing of a man who doesn't fall. Not to prove anything, but because he wanted to leave behind the image he believed was his best. A man who knew he was leaving, yet still stood tall. In those final years, Wayne no longer sought fame. He sought a little peace for what remained of his life, and he found it in simple moments. A full family meal, his children's laughter, Pilar's gentle touch, or the arm of an old friend resting on his shoulder during a visit. John Wayne was never a perfect man. He had cracks, mistakes, chapters far sadder than people imagined. But in this stage of life, people saw him differently. Not as an untouchable icon, but as a man who had learned to be more honest with himself, to cherish love more deeply, and to understand that it wasn't the spotlight, but love and forgiveness that were the final salvation. And in that simplicity, John Wayne, after decades of carrying the weight of a monument, finally found the light he had chased for a lifetime. The light of being loved for who he truly was, not for the legend Hollywood built around him. There are years when, as a person walks through the final stretch of life, they begin to feel more clearly the silence within themselves. After The Shootist and those last quiet years beside Pilar, John Wayne entered a period in which the loudest presence in his life was no longer the cheers of the audience, but the long stretches of silence. People still saw him as an unshakable icon, But he himself felt he was slowly becoming a relic of a time the new generation no longer understood. By 1978, Wayne could feel his body betraying him with unmistakable clarity. The cancer was no longer a dormant worry buried in old medical records. It had returned, quiet, cold, like the final debt life demanded he pay. But what frightened him was not death. It was the sense that he no longer had the strength to stand as tall as the symbol America had made of him. The man who once rode dozens of miles on horseback just to complete a shot was now breathless after climbing a few steps. Wayne still attended events, still shook hands with every fan, still forced a reassuring smile as if the pain in his body no longer existed. Once, a close friend asked why he kept trying so hard. Wayne simply said, "I owe them that." He didn't say, "I owe my career," or "I owe myself," but "I owe them." The people who had placed their faith in the image he had carried on his shoulders for decades. It was gratitude, but also the kind of pressure only those who have stood at the top for too long can understand. Pilar, though separated, was present in the moments Wayne needed most. They no longer shared a roof, but they kept for each other a tenderness neither ever spoke aloud. A family member said Pilar often sat beside Wayne's hospital bed at night, saying nothing, just letting her presence stand in place of every apology, every unfinished thread between them. Wayne never mentioned it, but he knew. Of his 3 marriages, Pilar was the one who had brought him a peace he was never skilled enough to hold on to. Their father, Michael, Ethan, Patrick, Marisa, Wayne tried to give them time as if he were chasing something long lost. Once, Ethan asked if he was afraid of dying. Wayne simply smiled, placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said, "I'm not afraid. I just regret being gone for so long." A quiet sentence, but one that made everyone understand that behind the image of the unbowing hero was a man who felt he owed his family far more than he could repay. On June 11, 1979, John Wayne left this world. No stage lights, no cheers, no final cinematic scene. Just family, a few last breaths, and a whispered line his daughter recalled years later. "I tried, sweetheart. I really tried." He didn't say he succeeded, didn't say he won. He simply said, "I tried." And within those 2 simple words lay a lifetime of collisions, failures, painful recoveries, and a belief that resilience sometimes matters more than everything else. After Wayne's passing, America fell silent. Not only because a legend had died, but because they realized he symbolized a time the country had once been proud of. A time of men who didn't flaunt their pain, didn't run from responsibility, didn't let the world see them fall. They looked at Wayne and saw their own youth reflected back, saw an America that was braver, more straightforward, less complicated. And that is why his legacy goes beyond numbers, beyond more than 170 films, countless cultural symbols, and generations of actors inspired by him. John Wayne was not just an actor. He was the embodiment of a kind of man America always believed it once had. But the most beautiful thing about him was not the roles he played, but the truth that after all the glory, he left this world with a humble final thought. "What remains is for God to decide," a sentence that reveals both the strength and the final loneliness of a man who had spent his whole life standing tall in the storm. The sunset of John Wayne was not as blazing as many imagine. It was quiet, soft, weighted with everything he had never said, and because of that, it carried a rare beauty. The beauty of a man looking back at the vastness of his own life and understanding that everything eventually fades into silence. leaving only what is most true to remain with time. The life of John Wayne is not the story of a flawless hero. It is the story of a man born with the name Marion Morrison, a name so gentle no one ever imagined it could become an icon, who then spent nearly half his life learning how to wear the mantle of the Duke that America placed on his shoulders. He lived through years of obscurity longer than almost anyone, stood on the margins of Hollywood long enough to know what it felt like to be forgotten, braced himself under the weight of fame until he lost his private peace, stepped into marriages filled with love yet scarred with wounds, and, in the end, when life approached its final bend, he wished only to be called by his old name, Marion, as if to remind the world that behind the hero was always a boy who never stopped trying to grow. 6 decades of work, more than 170 films, an Academy Award. Those numbers are merely the surface of the journey. What remains deeper, more enduring, is how John Wayne made audiences believe that strength does not lie in gunfire or broad shoulders, but in the ability to stand upright after the wavering years life hands you. He never acted to show off his toughness. He acted to remind himself that this toughness still lived in the heart of a man tested far too early. On the day he left this world, when his final breath slipped out as softly as a finger brushing against the past, he offered no dramatic farewell. Only one simple, profoundly deep sentence. I tried. The rest is up to God. Perhaps that is also how he lived his life. Not showy, not full of excuses, simply a man who tried harder than anyone ever saw. And that image, imperfect, unpolished, became the very reason he endures far longer than any role he played. In America's memory, John Wayne is not only Ringo Kid, not only Ethan Edwards, not only the hero riding into the sunset. He is the embodiment of an era, a spirit, a quiet belief that courage does not need to be shouted, only held onto in silence. And when his shadow finally sank into the horizon, people understood. There are heroes created by Hollywood, but there are also heroes who make Hollywood itself more worthy of belief, simply by being true to themselves. If John Wayne's journey reminds you of the strong people who must hide the cracks inside themselves, leave a small sign behind, so that stories like this can continue to be told, with the reverence owed to lives that walked through their own sunsets without ever letting their light go out. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more cinematic journeys into the lives behind the fame. This is Hollywood Biographies, the light, the silence, the legacy.